O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called Hegel and the Ontological Implications of Pure Thought About What's Not There. And this arose when I was thinking about something Cadell said in our recent conversation about the philosophy of lack, where he was pointing out how strange it is that we're able to think about total nothingness, because total nothingness doesn't exist in the world. So that's kind of strange, because if thought is always stimulated by materiality, or it's about materiality or things out there, then why are we able to think about something that doesn't exist, that's not out there? It's just kind of strange. And that got me thinking about why is it that Hegel focuses on contradiction. Now, what I'm about to talk about comes from my reading of Hegel. And I will attribute it to him as an interpretation. If it's totally wrong, I still hope that the ideas have some legitimacy. And also, too, what I'm going to trace out is not necessarily a hard proof of a case, but it is a description of a possibility, which I think we should consider. So when Hegel talks about contradiction, what's so interesting about contradiction is that contradiction doesn't exist. It's not in the world. It is a pure thought. When we commit contradiction, when we say confuse a dog with a cat, like we look out the window, we think we see a dog, but it's really a cat, or we make any sort of mistake or any sort of paradox, any of these kind of things, none of those exist in the world. If human beings did not exist, there would be no confusion of cat with dog. There would be no paradoxical situations. These exist because humans exist. And it's kind of strange. Throughout O.G. Rose, a distinction is made between caused and create. And if a rock were to roll down a hill, if a billiard ball were to hit another hill, these would be examples of causation. But if I think up the idea for a bookcase, and then I create a bookcase, the bookcase would have never come into existence without human beings coming up with the idea of a bookcase. And I suppose it's theoretically possible for a tornado to throw all the parts together, but in that situation, though perhaps that randomly assembled bookcase would be caused, that would not be equivalent to all the other bookcases ever made by a human being within, I guess, what is called an efficient form, to allude to Aristotle. But anyway, the bookcase that the person makes would be created. It would be different than caused. But you see, since bookcases and rocks are both inanimate, it's easy to think that rocks and bookcases are the same, but they're actually different. Rocks and bookcases are not the same. Where a rock is inanimate, a bookcase is inanimate with the IN in parentheses, as I like to put it. So likewise, so the problem, of course, becomes that we get so used to contradiction and we get so used to paradoxes and mistakes and errors that we just think they're another kind of thought. They're no different than the thought of thinking about what you're going to eat for breakfast today, or the thought of trying to figure out what an apple is. We just think it's another kind of thought. But Hegel understood that the thought of a contradiction was unique because it was a pure thought. It could not have reference to the world at all because there was no contradiction in the world, because a contradiction is a negation. It's a mistake, and there is no negation in the world. There's death, but death is a cessation after time. It's not an ontological negation. So a contradictory thought negates, but it seems like it's just another abstraction, another thought, like the thought of an apple. But the thought of an apple is trying to get at it, to unveil it, to represent what an apple really is. It's representative. And in this way, the thought of an apple, you see, this gets into what this kind of idea that in the Enlightenment, the dream of thinking, or the vision of thinking, was that everything that mattered, everything that existed, was ontological. It was something, and by that I mean it was something observable, it was something in the world. And the point of thinking was just to observe the ontological, that it was a secondary thing, that it didn't have any... thinking was always to be looked through, it was not to be looked at. But you see, what Hegel gets is that if we're capable of a contradiction, then that would suggest that thinking, because here's the idea, like total nothingness, since it doesn't really exist, we could say that it's purely epistemological, but it's not ontological, meaning that it's something we can think, but it's not something that is existent, it's not in the world. So a contradiction is a thought that is purely epistemological, but it's not ontological at all. That's kind of crazy. How is it that human beings are able to consider something that is not ontological at all, that is only epistemological? How is it that we are able to have a thought that has no reference? If human beings are capable of thinking a thought that has no reference, that it cannot be found, what is referred to cannot be found in materiality, then that would suggest that maybe a purely material case of human beings is not adequate, because human beings have a strange ability that shouldn't be there. Now, what's easy to do is, since a contradiction is a negation, it's easy to ignore the phenomenon of contradiction, because we say, it negates, it's off the table, so it's not something you would think about. It doesn't matter, it has no ontological significance. But you see, this mistake is very similar to thinking that just because ontological gaps, as I discuss in papers on Derrida, cannot be crossed, that therefore the ability to apprehend an object as itself is therefore irrelevant. And what I mean by that is Derrida did a very good job of showing we can never cross the gap between a signifier and the signified. Our idea of a cat and a true cat, per se. But what is argued, in other words, works is even if we can't cross any ontological or Platonic gaps, it does not follow that the very phenomenological act of apprehending a cat as that cat doesn't occur and isn't worth philosophical consideration. And those works on Derrida will argue that because we can apprehend that cat, even if we can't verify with any certainty that it's a true cat or something like that, that metaphysics is therefore legitimate. Similarly, just because contradiction may negate, just because pure thought as such has a negative principle, that does not mean that the ability to think contradiction doesn't need to be addressed. Even if contradiction negates, the very ability to think contradiction has to be addressed and is legitimate grounds for metaphysical consideration. Now, if we're capable of contradiction, which would be a thought that can never be brought into materiality, then is it such a stretch to think that we would be capable perhaps of form, which would be an idea that can be brought into materiality, and that form would be distinct from pure materiality, and that it would be distinct from purely reflective thought? So, for example, we tend to think that the idea of a bookcase that generates the bookcase has a material explanation and cause, and maybe it does, maybe indeed its origin is somehow material. But now that form is with us, the existence of pure thought would not make it implausible to think that maybe form cannot be explained in pure material terms. Another way I like to put it is, even if you can explain form through material origins, the material origins would not address the existence of form. There is now some sort of mental realm that is distinct from materiality, even if that mental realm is thanks to some Bedouin event from and break from materiality. But that's a different subject. But the main idea is that if we're capable of thinking pure thought, then why can't we think form, thought that can be realized in materiality? And why, therefore, is it hard to believe that the idea of a bookcase is somehow ontologically unique from a bookcase? I mean, right now we tend to think that there's really ultimately no ontological difference between the idea of a bookcase and an actual bookcase. They're just material. But Hegel gives us reason to think that there might be something else going on. And the fact that the contradiction, it's almost like he's using the contradiction as the extreme case of pure thinking, and then working backwards from that to suggest a uniqueness to ideas in general, which he associates with spirit. In the same way that in moral philosophy, you'll make an extreme case of the trolley problem and work back from there to suggest that simple moral reasoning is not adequate, because you can always come up with these thought experiments that complicate simple moral reasoning. Well, likewise, Hegel gives us reason to think that we need to complexify ontological reasoning. And yes, perhaps 9 out of 10 times, simple moral reasoning is all we need to deal with a situation. And likewise, perhaps simple ontological thinking is all we need to understand 9 out of 10 situations. But what if there is a category of situations that we need complex ontological thinking, and dare I say metaphysics, to understand? What if there is new thought that we need to understand the mind, that the thinking we use to understand the brain is not adequate? What if we need different kind of thinking in order to address the subject, that merely explaining the subject in terms of materiality is not adequate? Hegel gives us reason to think that some kind of new thought would not be crazy to pursue, because contradiction exists, and if contradiction exists, so exists pure thought, and we are capable of thinking contradiction. So what kind of creature must we be to be so able to think pure thought? Anyway, you can find the paper on ogrose.com. For more, please visit YouTube, Medium, Twitter, Instagram, all these things. And thank you for your time.